Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a bit of a different video. It's from a smaller channel called The Raven Diaries, and it's called Science vs. Evolution. Right off the bat, that title kinda gives away the game. Evolution is a part of science. It is not at odds with science. Anyway, let's see how it goes.
Hi there. Some YouTubers ask me, you say you were trained in the scientific method, yet you don't believe in evolution.
I'm not sure if that actually would be how I would choose to phrase the question. I haven't watched much of your channel, but from what I've seen, it kinda looks like you're a dabbler, someone who has a lot of interests and so is likely to not be particularly accomplished in any one of those interests, while still knowing enough to potentially impress the non-experts in that subject. There's nothing wrong with this. A lot of people are like that, but it is good to know that sort of thing about yourself so that you don't come across as being pretentious when discussing areas that you may be familiar with, but are not necessarily proficient in. But ultimately, this is all irrelevant. Just show us what you got.
Why? Well, that's a good question. For first, no, I love science.
You know, now that I think on it, I've only ever heard young Earth creationists preface their arguments with this insistence that they love science. The creationist doth protest too much, methinks.
And before I answer the question, let me share a story. There was a scientist that came home for a 3-day break in between his speaking engagements. He was just in time to see his child's first steps. He measured the first step on day 1, and then again on day 2, and then again the very first step on day 3.
Okay, I think I see where this is going, but let's let it play out a bit before I comment too much.
On the plane to his next engagement, he played with the figures, and he calculated that if this continues, by his return 5 weeks later, his child's going to step all the way to the moon.
Yep, that's exactly where I thought this was going. This sounds almost like it's supposed to be replying to that whole small steps can add up to large distances traveled thing, but only if you first completely misunderstand what is meant by that analogy in the first place.
Now you should be shaking your head and say, look, that's kind of impossible, isn't it? But the science proves it. On day 1, 2 inches were measured. Day 2, 4. Day 3, 8 inches. So rounded off, he kept going and going and going and changed it to feet and then the miles. And then by day 34, our scientists remembered the moon is an average about 240,000 miles away, so based on these scientific measurements, on day 34, he'll return to see his child stepping all the way to the moon, right?
No, not right, because of the known limitations on human growth. The purpose of the taking small steps analogy is not that the steps themselves get bigger, it's that each individual step by itself is tiny, but these tiny steps can add up to a kilometer if enough of them are taken. Hell, you brought up the moon. Do you remember what Neil Armstrong said when he first set foot on the moon? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Do you think that at any point during the astronauts' trip to the moon that any one of them took any significantly larger steps than they had at any other time in their lives? No, it was the accumulation of all the small steps that led to that one giant leap.
That's science. The numbers don't lie. And yet you should be thinking, yeah, but come on, that's impossible.
It is not impossible to take a series of small steps that, if they are correctly placed, will wind up with you standing on the moon. Sure, there is a lot more to it than just the steps involved, but at no point in human history has one person ever taken a step big enough to get us from the Earth to the moon, and yet 12 people have managed to take steps on the moon.
You're right. See, science can give us truth. But extrapolations, even ones based on very good science, can go too far.
Yes, extrapolation can go too far, and if you're extrapolating the wrong data like you are now, you will end up at a faulty conclusion.
We can reach conclusions that are scientific, but as I've just demonstrated, some are physically impossible.
No, if you've extrapolated from the wrong data, you have not reached a scientific conclusion. You've reached an incorrect conclusion that, if it may appear to be scientific at the moment, will be subject to revision in the future when more scientists take a look at your data. In fact, Piltdown Man, the creationist favorite, was forged to fit with existing expectations that human evolution began with the brain and ended with the jaw, so the find of a human-like skull with an ape-like jaw fit the expectations, which caused erroneous extrapolation from this bad data. It was the discovery of more data from other fossil specimens that led to Piltdown Man's eventual downfall, as better data revealed that any extrapolations drawn from Piltdown Man were in error. In your little analogy, the observation that growth rates are not constant throughout a person's life, and that they cut off in early adulthood, are enough to dismiss the conclusion that you have reached.
And for me, this is exactly what Darwin's argument for evolution does. I get the small variations, everybody does, just like the first 3 days in the example above. So why don't I believe his conclusion?
Apparently because you don't know how analogies work.
Well, because when I do the research, I find these extrapolations are physically impossible.
And how have you determined that? Have you written up your findings and tried to get them published in a peer-reviewed journal? Because that would really solidify your point.
I know there are changes at the species level, and maybe even up into the family levels. I know many variations of dogs, cats, and pigeons exist. But when I take it further, I find everything locked.
How so? Have you ever traced an evolutionary phylogeny? In the phylogenies for which we have the best data, there is very little difference between each of these levels, to the point where I would suggest that no creationist would deny the relationship. But the problem here is that we're relying on intuition at the moment. We're just looking at these things and saying, yeah, that looks like the same kind of thing, and no, those ones don't look like the same kind of thing. Using such superficial methods, I doubt that anyone who was not previously aware of a process such as metamorphosis would classify the many adult insects as the same kind as their larval stages. So, since we have clear examples of creatures that not only are they the same kind, but it's the same specific individual engaging in changes that with this superficial examination would render them different kinds, then either evolution is a definite possibility, and in fact is probably commonplace given just how commonplace metamorphosis is, or this superficial examination is inadequate for the purpose of drawing conclusions one way or the other. Take your pick.
Nobody can make a dog into a cat, or a cat into a dog.
No, but I can make a gross worm thing into a Hercules beetle. That's gotta count for something if we're just going by superficial appearances. But if we actually want to look into what evolution even is, and what suggests that it happens, then we find out that evolution would not expect a cat to evolve into a dog, or vice versa. Evolution predicts that each generation will only be slightly different from its parents, and at certain points where certain basic and essential functionality develops, it is easier for evolution to make changes to the existing structures to specialize them than it is for them to scrap the whole thing and go back to the drawing board. So we would expect to see a nested hierarchy of traits when we arrange them by similarity among different species who have had to adapt to different environments. And guess what? That's exactly what we do see.
Yet we teach our kids the same kind of animal not only became both, but a host of other things as well.
No, that animal specifically did not become both. There is a common ancestor that is shared between cats and dogs. The way you're phrasing it is really awkward. That would be like saying that your great-grandparents not only became you, but they became your cousins, second cousins, and a whole host of cousins removed by various degrees as well. That's not how ancestry works. It really is quite simple. If there were a group of these proto-carnivores that became divided for whatever reason, it would then become two groups. Now, unless both groups are living in completely identical environments, which is pretty much functionally impossible, there will be slightly different pressures on them. Maybe one group lives somewhere where water is harder to find, and the other lives somewhere with plenty of water but is scarce on food. Well, in the group that is in need of food, the ones that are better at efficiently using and storing their calories will have more reproductive success, leading to the enhancement of these calorie-conserving traits. But these traits will not be the same as the traits that may lead the other group to be better at surviving with minimal water. Then, as the generations go on, these differences become more accentuated until you have two clearly distinct groups of animals that each share this common ancestor. One small step for carnivora, one giant leap for filiforma, or something like that.
This is not science, this is a speculative story.
The story that I told was speculative, yes, but mine was only a hypothetical. Realistically, in evolution, we often do not know the inciting incident that caused the development of a particular trait, and so we are left to guess. But guessing about the why doesn't change the fact that the organisms about which we are guessing are in fact related, and the why stories that often accompany descriptions of evolved traits are usually a lot more plausible than the Christian story that explains why snakes don't have legs.
And to me, it's like stepping to the moon.
And to me, it's like stepping on the moon after taking many small steps that got you to the moon.
Look, scientists spent decades with fruit flies. No matter what they did, they remained fruit flies. They couldn't make them into some sort of crawly bugs or ants.
You can literally go on Amazon right now and order yourself a breeding colony of wingless fruit flies. Usually the creationists are aware of the wingless fruit flies, they just prefer to complain that a loss of function like that just shows degradation, it doesn't show evolution building anything new.
They couldn't make them into bees or wasps.
Were they trying? Do you have a source for an experiment that actually attempted to make fruit flies into bees or wasps? Because that really would be quite something, especially since evolution would not expect different organisms to evolve into each other like that. Best you can hope for is convergent evolution, where certain features are developed independently in order to fill an ecological niche.
They were stuck, as is everything in the natural world, whether it be cells, insects, plants, or animals.
Well, if cells are stuck as just cells, then I'm curious. What do you think you are made out of, and how do you suppose the human embryo develops?
That is a well-documented scientific fact.
No, that is a well-asserted creationist talking point. But the creationist inevitably fails to provide any specific definition of terms that would allow us to actually figure out what is meant by a changing kind or type, so that once such a change is observed, the creationist remains free to shuffle the goalpost farther down the field. I'd like just once for a creationist to appeal to the immutability of the kind, without appealing to examples to give an intuitive sense of what a kind even is. Just define it. You shouldn't have to say that sometimes the barrier is at the species level, sometimes it's at the family level, and sometimes it may be somewhere else. If there actually were a barrier, you should be able to point to exactly where it is.
I read most every Science and Nature magazine published from 1986 to 2016. And believe me, the science says the living world is locked so tight, we can't budge it.
So you'll be able to point to a scientific paper then? Something that might show where these locks that are locking nature so tight must be located? That'd be nice. Otherwise, you're just showing me a stack of magazines. They are excellent publications, to be sure, but they've been around for so long that just making an appeal to, trust me, I've read them and it's clear that nature's all locked up tight, without any specific citation is completely useless. How am I supposed to check that? Are you expecting me to read decades worth of journal publications in order to reach the same conclusions as you? Well, at any rate, I guess you're a step up from Kent Hovind and his wall of textbooks.
Now, I realize I have an unusually wild and curious nature. As a chef, I chose to make everything from scratch. So I have to know exactly what everything is made of. And that's the way I am with everything. My cooking, my appreciation of wine. How many people are both a chef and a sommelier?
I feel like you're using the terms chef and sommelier very loosely here. Now, I'll spare you the rest. He also likes birds, plays with lions, kisses bears on the nose, makes homemade surfboards, fences, and makes sea glass jewelry. How this is relevant is beyond me. I think he's just trying to say, look how good I am at all this other shit, so I'm clearly good at the sciencey shit too, which in reality could not be any less relevant. How good you are at hobby A in no way determines how good you will be at hobby Q, and in fact, having a multitude of hobbies necessarily makes you worse at all of them than you potentially could be. You can't be building surfboards while you're practicing fencing, so that's less practice for one of them just by virtue of the fact that time exists. So what I hear when you list this long list of hobbies is, look at me, I do lots of stuff, but I'm not great at any one thing in particular, and it doesn't inspire confidence.
So when I was being taught the theory of evolution, I went to the rock bottom of the belief system. I read Darwin's books. I found out everything I could about it and everybody who wrote about it.
You know, groundbreaking as it was, Darwin's book is hardly the modern authority on the matter. It is more than 150 years old, after all. You likely would have done better if you went to Berkeley's Evolution 101 website. As to the sentence you highlighted, notice that it's on page 11. Darwin often prefaced his writings with an explanation as to why the reader might be very reasonable in thinking that he is mistaken in his conclusions. It's a rhetorical tactic meant to get people to read his book with less hostility.
I studied the science about it. Most of my classmates did not.
Well, what was the class? Are we talking high school biology, college, general biology class, or specifically evolutionary biology? There will be a great deal of difference between the level of specifics that are gone into for each of these independent classes, but generally speaking, a class on biology is supposed to cover our most up-to-date understanding of it at the time of the class. And you say all this while highlighting a sentence in Darwin's book that essentially says, sorry, I know for a book like this I should be citing other publications, but there haven't been any on this topic yet because this is a brand new discovery. I don't understand why that is supposed to be damning.
They didn't read the original books.
One does not need to read the original books to come to a modern understanding of evolution. This is not a religious text we're talking about where the original books are considered to be holy and inerrant. They're just books. What information they contain that is still relevant can be found in sources that have been updated to include the new discoveries of the past century and a half, and which exclude that which was found to be in error.
They just accepted what was being taught by the instructors.
Well, again, this depends on what level course we're talking about here, but if it was high school or a college elective course, then likely the majority of your classmates didn't care at all. They just wanted to hurry up and pass the course so they could forget all that stuff that they don't need to know in their lives.
And how about you? Have you ever read Darwin's books?
Not in their entirety. I find most writings from that time period to be rather long-winded and uninteresting. As I said, Darwin's books are not some form of divine scientific canon where finding a mistake in one of them is going to shatter our faith in evolution to its very core. They're just books. The dude was brilliant, and he got a lot of stuff right, but he was also wrong about a lot because he was a human being, and human beings are often wrong about things.
Have you ever bothered to find out if what you were taught, and is still taught, even possible?
Yes, I have. And my conclusion is that it is possible.
Or do you just choose to accept it?
Well, I mean, I am accepting the consensus of at least a few 100,000 biologists who have spent way more time than I have specializing in areas that wouldn't even be possible to specialize in were it not for the fact that evolution happens. But really, that is something that we all have to do in our lives. It is physically impossible to specialize in enough science to actually fully understand everything that we need for our day-to-day lives. But for some reason, you don't see people making YouTube videos railing against the study of, say, exoplanets on the grounds that a lot of lay people haven't looked into all the nitty-gritty details of the science behind how they are discovered. Did you know that we've never even seen most exoplanets? The first ever imaging of an exoplanet didn't happen until last year in July of 2020, and the scientists are saying that there are thousands of them out there. Well, they haven't seen them. They've just seen stars dimming a bit or wobbling a bit. Maybe most exoplanets aren't actually exoplanets, but are some other undiscovered phenomenon. You don't know. Have you looked into the science behind exoplanets? Future Rhino cutting in for a second. Turns out I misread the article when I looked up the first direct imaging of an exoplanet. July of 2020 was the first time 2 exoplanets had been imaged in one single image, but there have been 27 exoplanets that have been directly imaged, with 12 of them possibly being planetary mass brown dwarfs rather than exoplanets. The first exoplanet to be imaged was actually in 2004, so I was off by a lot. Like, I know 2020 was a long year, but it wasn't that long. Anyway, my point still stands. There have been more than 4,000 confirmed exoplanets, with several thousand more suspected exoplanets that are awaiting confirmation, but we've only seen 27 of them, so obviously these scientists are up to something. There's so much extrapolation with no direct observation. Yeah, no, that's ridiculous. But for some reason, people find this sort of argumentation compelling when it comes to biology.
So when people on my YouTube channel ask me, how could I have studied to be a scientist and not believe in evolution?
I wouldn't ask that. I would just stop at the, how have you studied to be a scientist? Judging by how you presented yourself as though you're a professional chef, sommelier, fencer, and everything else, then I'm going to just go ahead and assume that your interest in science amounts to a hobby rather than thinking you are actually a professionally trained scientist. Now, I'm not saying that none of those things are this guy's profession, or that he is not professionally trained in one or maybe even more than one of those things, but the more things you claim to be an expert in, the less I am inclined to believe any of it. And the fact that you just keep referring to yourself as having studied to be a scientist rather than just getting specific kind of supports this idea. Most scientists don't go around bragging about how they studied to be a scientist. They just say, when relevant, I have X degree from Y institution and am currently researching Z. Now, don't get me wrong, I certainly don't have any scientific degrees or professional training myself, but I am also not representing myself as though I do.
as if it's some mandatory thing to be able to even do science, I have to scratch my head and wonder, what makes you believe it's even remotely possible?
When I first started to accept evolution, I did have the occasional lingering doubt, but the more I looked into it, the less valid those doubts appeared to be. Are there things we don't know about evolution? Sure, but that's kind of the whole point of science, figuring out things that we don't know yet.
Because in the 40 years I've looked, I found nothing. In fact, everything that was used for the proof of evolution in my school days in the 60s and 70s has been overturned and abandoned.
Everything? Really? Because as much as I'm pointing out that Darwin did get stuff wrong in his book, he also got a lot right, and that stuff is still around. And it certainly was around in the 60s and 70s. DNA was just making its debut in evolutionary biology around that time, and while our methods have been refined quite a bit since then, it has not been overturned. But also, and again this is part of what is leading me to doubt that this guy has any sort of formal scientific education, he's showing images that are representative of hypotheses about things like the origin of the moon and water on the Earth, which have nothing to do with evolution at all. Those are completely separate issues from the theory of evolution, and the fact that we have collected more data and adjusted our hypotheses to account for this new data is a good thing.
And isn't even taught anymore. In fact, it's incorrect.
Would you prefer that scientists continue to teach things after they are found to be incorrect? That's the alternative here. If your complaint is that science changes to account for new data, then you definitely are not a qualified scientist.
And it was the evolutionary horsey story. You don't see it much anymore. You know why? Because it's just not true.
No, the equine family tree is still one of the most well-documented phylogenies in paleontology. It's certainly not as simple as some textbooks present it, but it hasn't been overturned by any stretch of the imagination. Now, on screen, he's got that quote from David Raup, where he said, "Some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. The creationists like to use this quote to imply that the phylogeny of horses had to be discarded. But notice that he didn't say discarded, he said discarded or modified. The horse one has been modified as a result of more detailed information. As we learn more, we change our conclusions to fit with what we have learned."
That's why you'll see on my channel, I don't believe the dinosaur to bird story. And the complexity of modern science shows me that the physical limitations and the massive amount of changes that must take place for a dinosaur to become a bird are like a step to the moon. It's physically impossible.
Okay, so again, there's a lot of visual materials in this one that he doesn't directly talk about, but he's got a chart up of the transition from dinosaurs to birds. And while it would be an oversimplification to suggest that any one of these were an ancestor of any of the others, there are very minor differences between each of the neighboring groups, such that it is easy to picture minor modifications leading from one to the other. And of course he takes issue with the fact that none of these are depicted as actually being ancestors of any of the other ones, because without genetic evidence, it's actually not possible for us to determine conclusively if one group were really the ancestors of another, or if they're just representative of a similar group that was around at the same time. Just picture this. 1,000,000 years from now, our society has collapsed and all our records are lost, but society rebuilt itself from scratch. Future paleontologists may now come across fossilized huskies and determine that they are the evolutionary ancestors of one of their whatever dogs will evolve into. But as it turns out, dogs went extinct when our society collapsed, so it was actually the wolves that were the ancestor of that future animal. How would they tell just from looking at the fossils? They couldn't, but the representation is close enough that it doesn't make a great deal of difference.
An arm to a wing is physically impossible.
They are literally the exact same structures with modified shapes of the different bones. I don't see how that's impossible. Lengthen this one a bit here, shorten that one a bit there, fuse a couple over there. All relatively commonplace variations and mutations. Add them onto each other over time, and boom, a clawed theropod arm becomes a theropod wing.
Two-way lungs to one-way lungs are physically impossible.
I mean, tracing the development of soft organs is difficult owing to the rarity of these soft tissues being fossilized, but a lot of the structures that are important to the avian respiratory system can be found in various stages of development all through the avian lineage, from the proto-birds like Archaeopteryx to the non-avian theropods like Allosaurus to the non-dinosaur dinosauriforms like Silosaurus. But yeah, you said it was impossible, so I guess you'll just ignore all the published research which has suggested otherwise. And since you said that you have read almost every issue of Science and Nature from 1986 to 2016, this one from the July 2005 issue of Nature was certainly on your list of papers that you should be familiar with. Even if you consider the development of the avian respiratory system to be impossible, the fact that it is also found in the theropod dinosaurs should at least cause you to question your assertion that birds are not dinosaurs.
All the possible transitions that can be imagined would die.
A lack of imagination on your part does not do anything to actually show this process to be impossible.
And the same goes for an animal that goes from producing scales to one producing feathers.
The evolution of feathers from scales is pretty well understood at this point and has been covered extensively in the scientific literature. We've even managed to determine that the reptile-like scales that birds have on their legs are actually a form of convergent evolution, being morphologically similar to reptile scales but having a different evolutionary history. Funnily enough, they evolved from feathers, which evolved from scales, so the history of the scales is that they used to be scales but then turned into feathers before modifying the feathers in a different way to become a different type of scale. So not only do we know how scales turned into feathers, but we know how feathers turned back into scales. Now, in the video, he is pointing to Figure 1 of a paper which purports to show specimens exhibiting stages 1 through 5 of Prum's model for feather evolution. He says that there are no transitions between the stages, but the stages are, in fact, transitions themselves. Very minor modifications to each stage could easily lead to the next stage. But let's forget all that. We're not here for a primer on feather evolution. I'd rather just point out that he clearly is not reading these journals carefully enough, as just a few months after that paper was published, another group of scientists published a commentary on that paper pointing out that the scientists did not adequately control for the possibility that the specimens they were examining were actually just mammal hairs instead of avian feathers. Now, this doesn't actually do anything to disprove Prum's model of feather evolution. It's just an example of scientists calling each other out when they see sloppy work rather than banding together to promote evolution at all costs like creationists pretend they do. But that's just the sort of thing that creationists love to pounce on. Instead of just pointing to the picture and saying there are no transitions between these stages in a Futurama-esque aha, but now that you've described another transitional stage, there's another missing stage. You could have just pointed to the fact that the specimens being discussed had not been adequately examined to ensure that they were, in fact, representative of feather evolution and not just mammalian hair.
And the people that tell these stories leave out one important issue. All of this has to happen at the same time to the same creature in order for it to be called a bird.
No, you seem to have missed the gradual part of this whole thing. Nothing in evolution suggests that all the changes between a descendant and their ancestor must happen simultaneously in one individual somewhere in the ancestral line. In fact, if you could find something like that happening, that would be a pretty good indicator that we have a fundamental misunderstanding of the mechanisms of evolution.
It can't happen today, and it could not have happened at any time in the past.
And it is not expected to happen today, or to have happened at any time in the past.
So to me, the grand evolutionary story is nothing more than a story concocted by a bunch of red queens who play in the mud and collect rocks.
Spoken like a true scientist. Nothing like petulantly dismissing the life work of millions of scientists over the last 150 years on the grounds that you have a hard time imagining transitions, despite them being very well described in the literature that you claim to read.
Why? Perhaps to get money.
Oh yeah, everyone knows that every evolutionary biologist is just rolling in the dough. Give me a break. The average evolutionary biologist makes about $70,000 per year, so definitely a decent income, but not "I must protect the conspiracy at all costs" levels of wealth. Now I'm skipping a bit. He cuts to himself chasing a bird away that was standing on one foot, and then shows that it left one footprint when it ran away, and then asks, "Are you going to tell me that the dinosaurs did this?" And I don't really even know what the point of that was. Like, he shows images of a journal article that shows Native American carvings that look like bird tracks, but they were in sandstone that is unlikely to preserve tracks because of how it forms, and the tracks themselves have indications that they were carved rather than having been formed naturally. Aside from it being a type of stone that is unlikely to preserve footprints in general, the tracks do not resemble naturally forming trackways. They are far too regular, and the tracks themselves are overly simplistic and symmetrical. But at one point in the article, it does state that they couldn't be modern birds because they are markings belongs in Jurassic rock, but he kind of misses the point with that. It's not that they are dismissing them as being made by birds because of when the rocks date to. That's just one piece of evidence. It is entirely possible, though unlikely, that a bird with such a foot structure did exist in the Jurassic. As such, a fossil find that indicates that would need to be extremely well documented, and there are just too many other problems with these tracks for that to be the case.
Their stories completely ignore the overwhelming complexity of living systems and their limitations.
Isn't it nice that he shows us that scientists are ignoring complexity by pointing to an article by scientists published in Nature that describes this complexity that they're ignoring? What do you think you're even proving here?
And there are scientists that address this. Prum and Brush said, although evolutionary theory provides a robust explanation for the appearance of minor variations, it does not yet give much guidance for understanding for the emergence of entirely new structures, including digits, limbs, eyes, and feathers.
Well, for starters, I think it's amusing that you're quoting the guy who developed one of the top models for feather evolution as support for the idea that such evolution is impossible, but more to the point, this quote isn't even saying what you think it's saying. It does not yet give as much guidance for understanding is the key part of the quote. As you can see in your own video, this is a discussion of how evolution is very robust in its explanation for minor variations in the size and shape of creatures and their component parts, and it does give some guidance, but we don't understand these particular features as well as the other ones. It's literally just saying, here's an area that needs more research. And fun fact, that article was published in 2004. One of his complaints in that article is that we don't have very many examples of primitive fossil feathers. Well, that has since been rectified. There are lots of them now. We have a much greater understanding of feather evolution now than we did in 2004, in no small part thanks to the work of the author of this article.
There never could have been one of anything. Not one amino acid, not one protein, not one RNA, not one cell, not one creature of any sort whatsoever.
This statement betrays your complete lack of understanding not only of evolutionary processes, but just of biology in general. What do you even mean by one RNA, for instance? What is a singular RNA in your mind? RNA is not some monolithic molecule, but more to the point, aside from potentially the process of abiogenesis, which we don't fully understand at this point, there never would have been evolution going on in individual organisms. Evolution happens at the population level, so no, nobody would claim that there would have been one singular anything that was spearheading its own evolution. And that's where I'll leave it for this one. He does go on for a bit more talking about the motivations that scientists have for coming to their evolutionary conclusions, but it's nothing that's really worth addressing. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Alt Control Spud, who says, "You should play Among Us with Matt Powell, Kent Hovind, and Ken Ham." To which I say, oh my god, I would pay so much money to see Hovind and Ham try to figure out anything in Among Us. Hovind, of course, would make his ordinary technical difficulties joke about how my computer isn't evolving all by itself. But just watching them struggle with figuring out how to do the tasks would be absolutely glorious in my opinion. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the bird lungs that started developing in the dinosaurs that are my channel. If you'd like to be impossible, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!